see me though, so we'll just go from here. Okay, so we're off and running. Joe Barnes, thanks for the introduction. Yes, I mean this work, I started working with Ferruginous Hawks in 2017, so it hasn't been forever. As Lauren noted, I've been doing raptor work in Nevada since 2004. I guess it's going on my 22nd year. A lot of that was golden eagles, peregrine falcons, and most of those projects are carrying over. So I've worked for various agencies, worked for the Park Service, have done independent work, worked for NDOW, Nevada Department of Wildlife for a little over 9 years. And now I've been with US Fish and Wildlife Service for 3 years. But I've carried a lot of my projects over from as I go from place to place. So I've been very fortunate in those regards. So we'll jump into the Ferruginous Hawk stuff, which is why you're all here. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so, I mean, I've done an awful lot of raptor work in Nevada and will continue doing so, hopefully for a long time. But so much of this stuff, it's a big state, wide open space, and there's a lot of animals out there to try to understand. So most of what I do couldn't be done effectively without collaborating and working really closely with people and relying on people's help. So for this project, it's been critical, some of the work from my collaborators. First and foremost would be Mariah Colada with Nevada Department of Wildlife. She's out in Healy, she's a biologist. She started with me, and we've been kind of co-leading the project in White Pine County for these past 9 years or so. Mackenzie Jeffress, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, she's also a biologist with Nevada Department of Wildlife up in Elko. So she helped corral and do a lot of the monitoring in Elko County for about 5 years. Some of you might know Mike Yates in the middle lower portion. He's with Earthspan, but he actually started doing Ferruginous Hawk work independently on his own back in 1999 in the Lovelock area, and we'll definitely detail some of that. So that predated my work with Ferruginous Hawks by a good 2 decades, and so I've been just fortunate to be able to take over where he left off, and then kind of carry on his vision and also bring his data around full circle. And you'll see a lot of that right now, or anyways, in the future slides here. And also Sue Fox indicated she's with Wildlife Resource Consultants. She's been awesome to work with. She has done a lot of her work's been for other projects, but she's been super willing to share data and really willing to collect the data that's needed to make a good, meaningful conclusion and things. So her work in Northwestern Nevada has been integral, and it's been really, really helpful. Okay, so why study Ferruginous Hawks? One, they're very understudied for one. So it's kind of almost a low-hanging fruit. Not a whole lot is known about them in a relative sense when you compare them with, like, say, a peregrine falcon or a bald eagle or something like that. But they're a fascinating species nonetheless. You know, they focus in the arid Western North America, primarily US, but bouncing up into Canada. Nest and forage primarily in grasslands, shrub steppe environments, and deserts. They are one of the, probably in North America, the most plastic nesting raptor species. So basically they will nest in very, very many different situations. They're really, really flexible. They'll put nests on the ground, on cliffs, rocky outcrops, power lines, plenty of anthropogenic structures, even oil and gas wells in various locations. So it's one of the most flexible nesting species of raptor that I know of, at least here in North America. So there's a lot to be learned still. One quick thing, I mean, you guys probably all know this here, but they're the largest boodio in North America, and that's the broader genus that's shared with red-tailed hawks, Swainson's hawks, broadwing hawks, things like that. So they trend a little larger than the runner-up, which would probably be the red tail. They're being a top of the line kind of high level avian apex predator. You would think, you know, they're going to be pretty durable, and they are in certain ways, but they're also highly vulnerable to disturbance from human impacts. So whether that's direct disturbance at nests, or whether it's habitat loss or habitat fragmentation, all of which they're quite vulnerable to. And it's basically they're relatively shy and reclusive species. So just to kind of show you on the right-hand side of this of your screen, this is just this is an eBird model based on data from various sources. It's published in 2020 in the Birds of the World species account. And you'll note in Nevada, there's various shades that you see here. Purples are year-round resident locations. Shades of red are breeding, but they tend to migrate to outside of the breeding season. Blues are wintering areas, and then yellows are primarily migration areas. Nevada is a little bit of everything. So lots of shades of variations of red and purple in there. So getting into a project, especially a project attempting to be statewide in scope, it's really important to kind of focus on your objectives. What are you really looking for? What I have been trying to do is address some of those knowledge gaps in the state. Again, it's an understudied species. There's a lot we don't know about them. So in terms of natural history, what are their nesting requirements? How well do they do reproductively? What's their annual survival rates? Things like that. As well as just simple basics like what do they require for habitat, for foraging and nesting and wintering. So those are all kind of key components that I've tried to address. And to get at a lot of that, we think in terms of territory persistence. You know, this is a highly territorial animal with pretty high site fidelity. So it means once they have a breeding territory, they will usually come back year after year if given a chance. And so that's one way we can kind of get a handle on local or project area population health, is looking at how well those territories persist over time. And then thinking about breeding success, how well are they doing annually, and also trying to tie in some variables as far as climate and you know, different landscape development schemes like that. Survival, habitat use, that's all part of it. And then my goal has always been, you know, every project that I've tackled, I've tried to look at it from an applied science type perspective. So not necessarily, I mean, learning is great, academia is wonderful, but I try to bring my data and make it relevant to either land or wildlife managers. And so, in terms of what is probably the most stressful for Ferruginous hawks, and also what we kind of have an ability to influence, would be some of these things like how do large scale landscape development projects, how do they impact Ferruginous hawks? How do pinyon juniper woodland treatment projects influence Ferruginous hawks, and how well do they persist? A lot of those, for those of you that don't know, those are efforts oftentimes attempting to kind of reduce or thin pinyon juniper woodlands to benefit sage grouse. Which I'm all for, but we want to make sure we do that in a wise way that doesn't also impact other species like Ferruginous hawks. And then also habitat restoration efforts. I think it's really critical to address that as well. So you can have habitat restoration for any number of reasons. What tends to be one of the bigger drivers of that is the prevalence and the increased frequency of wildfires. And so you've got a lot of different landscape, land management agencies that try to minimize, mitigate, offset some of those impacts. Providing information on what this species truly needs is huge in my mind. It's really beneficial to know what tree density do they need, what type of shrub component, things like that. So that's what I'm attempting to address, as well as then bring in, basically establish a better idea for what is their status here in Nevada. Are they upward trending, holding, downward trending as far as population goes? And then provide that input to federal and state wildlife and management agencies. So right here, what I'll show you in the next series of slides will be these dots that you see on the right-hand side. Those are all individual Ferruginous hawk nests, and they all represent at least one or more nests within territories. To start off, in 2018, while I was still working with Endo, I spearheaded a statewide effort to have our regional biologists and also our partnering agencies take on anywhere from 5 to 10 Ferruginous hawk territories and then go out. These were territories that were already known. So basically go out to these sites and reassess whether or not they're occupied and what's going on at them. And so we looked at the first cut was looking at 44 different territories, and these are all kind of these blue dots that you see over on the map. these all, or almost all, I think 2 or 3 of them were outside of the pinyon juniper distribution in the state. The rest of them were all in this pinyon juniper woodland and sagebrush ecotone. That's really the transition area. So where pinyon juniper woodlands meet sagebrush, that's the primary area where Ferruginous hawks are nesting, at least in central, eastern, and northeastern Nevada. We'll get into northwestern here. But yeah, so we learned several things during that effort. It was a 3-year effort, 2018 through 2020. The biggest take home for me, which helped kind of guide how I wanted to, carry the project forward in future years, was this very, very high occupancy rate of previously known territories. So 91% of them turned out they were occupied when we looked. And that's after an average of 17 years that had passed from when those territories were first discovered to when we came and reassessed. The range there was anywhere from 4 to 42 years. So it was extremely exciting. I think I had, we're at 2 different territories that hadn't really been looked at. We didn't have any serious record of study from when they were first discovered until when we took a look in 2018, and they were still occupied. We don't necessarily know that they were occupied in their intervening years, but it was pretty encouraging to see this really high, kind of carry through annually. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. We don't know. I mean, I can kind of address some of that stuff, but yeah, there's still plenty we don't know. And that's like, yeah, as far as where you're talking about as natal dispersal and where offspring go to breed when it's basically their turn, and we really don't know. And I would say we don't know for Nevada, but we really don't know in a very solid way anywhere in the West. It's a hard species to study, and to get that type of data is pretty tough. So now there really are 3 components to what I'm going to talk to you today about. The first was that statewide effort, which I'm actually done with now. So that was really kind of the precursor, just kind of get our feet in the water. And again, I was working with NDOW regional biologists. So it was just try to get a gut check. How are we doing out there? And then from that, slightly preceding that, but basically, because in 2017, I had done a pilot effort in central Nevada. And so that slightly predated the statewide effort, but it basically, springboarded and spearheaded the rest of the effort up to the present time. But first, they're color coded, so I'll try to keep it easy. The sites in the Northeast I have for these in the next several slides, they're in green. In the Northwest will be red. So that's a key index or an indicator when you're watching. But this effort in the Northeast, I note here that it was from 2017 through 2025. It's an ongoing effort. There's every reason to believe we'll keep doing it in future years. But I had to at least draw a line where I was going to stop the analysis. We have a total of 47 territories in those northeastern, basically 3 focal study areas that you see here in the 3 circles. Those are all exclusively occurring within this pinyon juniper sagebrush transition zone. And then to compare that with what's been done in the Northwest, which I mentioned collaborators. So none of the Northwestern work would be possible without the help of Sue Fox and Mike Yates. Starting some work pretty early. And Mike started in the Lovelock area again back in 1999, which you see in the furthest south red circle there. And then some of the other sites popped on and began in earnest from 2015 onward. But we have 69 different territories from those 3 focal study areas that we've carried through and that I'll talk to you today about. So now, to give you a little whiplash, back to the Northeast. Notice the green color coding. Just to kind of bear down and explain what we were doing there. We have these 3 study areas separated by about 90 and 160 kilometers between each. These were, for the most part, ground-based surveys, intensive 2-hour or more survey efforts, really focusing on trying in each of these survey areas, trying to get a solid, comprehensive idea of how many territories were out there, how many nests they had, and also what was their breeding success, what was their annual occupancy. So we're trying to get big picture on everything. And that meant surveys had to encompass the entirety of the breeding season. So basically late March through early to mid-July for the most part. The 2 southernmost study areas here also had the advantage of, we conducted some aerial surveys which is pretty critical. And you do see some of these images, some of the photos that I've got there. It's a wide open landscape. It's actually when you're strictly doing surveys only from the ground, it can be fairly tough to pick out all individual territories. So I used these aerial surveys to kind of augment that effort, find additional nests, additional territories that then could be followed up on the ground in subsequent monitoring. Now you compare that to some of the efforts in the Northwest. Again, 3 different study areas, about 70 and 80 kilometers between them. Focusing first in the Lovelock area. These are ground-based surveys, again, covering 1999 up through 2024. Mike, again, started those off. I didn't really get going in earnest until I think 2020. In which case he moved to the east side of the country and I picked up the survey effort. So it's in that part, in recent years anyways, it's been a joint tandem effort. That's a little bit different. So we haven't been able to focus as much time on rigorous monitoring. What we've done is we've tried to high grade our approach and go in the mid-breeding season, middle portion, and then later portion. So try to assess how many are attempting to breed, trying to get a comprehensive view of exactly how many territories and how they're aligned spatially, but then trying to get an idea of how that end result, how many of them are successful. But that kind of omitted the early season surveys. And that kind of changes on how you can use the data a little bit. You compare that to the 2 northern sites or study areas in the Northwest, and these were picked up and carried by Sue from 2013 to 2023. This was a different effort altogether. It was using helicopters, so coming in from the air and trying to pick up nests and territories that way. And the focus here was looking at early season occupancy and also getting a comprehensive view of number of nests and arrangement of nests on the landscape. So we haven't been able to go and do a significant amount of post-breeding season or late breeding season surveys yet. So because of that, some of this data is not really appropriate to use as far as breeding success and whatnot. But all of these efforts together are really, really critical as far as painting the full picture of what's going on with Ferruginous hawks here. So I do get a lot of questions about where do they nest. They are kind of, for being such a big species, they're hard to find nests, and especially if you don't have a helicopter. What I'll do first is just kind of tell you what we've seen in the Northwest. Out of 95 different nests that we've picked up at those 69 different territories, or 67, whatever it is. On average, they're about 5.5 meters in height off the ground. But that, I mentioned they were highly flexible nesting species. So they're nesting on the ground, as you see in that lower right-hand picture. They're also on cliffs. They're on rocky outcrops on these tufa stacks. You know, various, even in a couple of instances on power lines, on power poles and whatnot. So on average, about 5.5 meters up in the air. So we're talking 16, 17 feet up, anywhere from 0 to 30 meters. The number of nests per territory. So they are territory animals, which means they'll come back to the same area year after year. But in any given year, they're only going to use one nest at a time. We found that per territory, there's anywhere from 1 to 5 nests within a territory. Now, on average, that's about 1.6, 1.57 nests per territory. This next row down, if I had a clicker, I'd point. But the average distance between nests, this mean nest distance, this is nests within territory. So it just gives you an idea of how they spatially arrange their nests by breeding by territory. And so on average, it's about 269 meters, although that ranges anywhere from 2 meters up to over 881 meters. Then the next in the final row here, this mean nearest neighbor distance, NND, that's what that means. So average nearest neighbor distance, that gives you a really good index on how tightly they can pack as a breeding population. So what's their spacing in between neighboring territories? So on average in the Northwest, it was 2.1 kilometers. That's ranged anywhere from 0.3 kilometers up to 8.6. 0.3, keep in mind, that's 300 meters. So that's exceedingly tight, very, very closely packed. But on average, just over 2 kilometers. Now, to compare that with, just attempt to compare that. Oh, now the arrows first. Okay, so to compare that with the Northeast, in this case, we have none of these nests are on rocky outcrops. They're all in junipers. I do know in the Northeast, we have some locations where Ferruginous hawks are nesting on cliffs and out rocks. But for the most part, they're in trees with kind of hanging quotes because they're not very big trees in most cases. On average, the tree height is just over 3 meters. So we're talking up around 9 or 10 feet. That ranges anywhere from 1.5 up to 5.5 meters. And a 5.5 meter tall juniper is a pretty big juniper. So it's interesting when you're trying to get up and ban nestlings then. The overall number of nests is very similar. So 1 to 4 nests in the Northeast. Again, 1.58 is the average. The distance between those nests within territories is also very similar, 281 meters. And then the average nearest neighbor distance, so that index of how dense the breeding population can squeeze in, on average is a little denser than we see in the Northwest. It's 1.5 kilometers. The range is between 0.8 and 2.1 kilometers between territories. So to kind of show you what that looks like on the landscape, this aerial image from Google Earth that you see in the main portion of the screen, this is one territory. You'll see the 3 different nests indicated that are in those pink thumb tabs. And then all I did is basically draw out roughly a 100-meter radius from one of the nests. And within, what you do see some of these rocky outcrops from the aerial imagery. This is also the same nest or territory that you see up in the upper right-hand corner. So you get an idea of how they're spatially arranged and all of these outcrops are potential nesting substrate. And the territory, both in the Lovelock area, but it just gives you kind of an idea of what they're using habitat-wise. And you can compare that with the Northeast, where again, they're all nesting in trees. In this case, same scenario, we're showing a 100-meter radius around one of the nests in one particular territory. When we say, for those of you that haven't spent a ton of time out there, when we talk about pinyon juniper woodlands, again, that's with hanging quotes because these are not dense forests. Pretty lean, and again, they're in that transition area between sagebrush and pinyon juniper. So there's a whole lot more sagebrush than there is juniper for the most part, or pinyon. So this particular territory it's shown in the upper right-hand photo. I would give bonus points. You guys in the front have an unfair advantage, but there's a nest in the lower of those 2 trees, and there's also an incubating female in that nest. So you can see, in some cases, they're pretty obvious depending on angle and sunlight, but in other cases, they're extremely cryptic and very, very hard to find, even from the air. So the picture on the lower right, totally different territory. The trees that you see in the background, this is one of the denser woodlands that we find Ferruginous hawks in. So another comparative comparison further, and again, sticking with green to the Northeast and trees, and red Northwest and no trees. This is looking at annual average territory occupancy by year. And I focused just on these 6 years, 2018 through 2023, because that's when we had the most comprehensive data set for all of those focal study areas. So really what we're trying to do is look at the occupancy rate. And it's is defined as one, or ideally more, ideally a breeding pair, holding a territory with the opportunity to nest or to breed that year. So each year you see the overall average, and it's 0 to 1 or 0 to 100 if you want to think in terms of percentage. In the Northeast, during that time window, we had 88.7% occupancy. Totally different image in the Northwest, where it was 28.3 on average. And you see a little bit of variation there. But one thing to note is it's easy, especially as a raptor biologist, you think in generalized terms of territory occupancy. Well, what does that mean? For a highly territorial bird with high site fidelity, that usually means if you have low occupancy, you're losing birds. Birds are dying. In some cases, they might move from territory to territory, and some species do that a little more than others. But for the most part, if it's, you expect some variation between and within years, but when it's either a dramatic drop or it's a drop sustained over a period of time, that's either an indication of a declining population or a steeply declining population. Either way, it's not a good sign. And there's another incubating mom, beautifully, a little bit more obvious there, but holding her own in the nest. Again, as I fly by in a helicopter, bothering her. So another way to look at this and to kind of take it another step further is, what does it mean when you have persistent, ongoing, low occupancy rates? So there is no like absolute way to think about this. What I used after looking at the data is I kind of used a critical window of 8 years of monitoring. If there was absolutely no evidence of occupancy, I would consider that territory basically no longer persistent. It's been vacated. I still will go out year after year after year, beating my head against the wall and look for them. I'm assuming that that territory is no longer on the landscape. And so I use that. My first cut was looking at 8 years. Well, it's pretty hard. 8 years is a high bar, especially when you're looking at 100 territories overall. And so then I came in with a second tier way to look at it. And that was 4 years of solid survey work. And then not only were they not there, but absolutely all of the nests, none of them showed any evidence of refurbishment, and there were no new nests on the landscape. So really that was critical for the Northwestern studies, because we were either coming in early in the season and not revisiting sites later, or the other way around, we were coming in later in the season and we didn't have the full picture from early season visits. And so I use those two criteria. When you pool everything, Northwest compared to Northeast, you have overall, you see on the top row there, 52% persistence in the Northwest compared to 97% persistence in the Northeast, which means 48% of those territories in the Northwest have been vacated. Now, to just kind of focus what I'm showing you, these dots here in the map, this is in the Lovelock area, 26 different territories that have, at this point, have been looked at over a quarter century. So 26 years now, I believe. 22% of them are still persisting. Not a great picture. And what that looks like right now, it's basically these 6 territories. They're still basically, several of them, they're occupied year after year, but we've lost 78% of all nesting territories. You compare that to that next study area north of here. So this is in the Kama range, thanks to Sue. So 13 territories are up there. 42% of those are still persisting, again, meaning 58% have gone away. The way that looks is these are the yellow stars, are the ones that are still out there in the landscape. The Built Creek range, so the furthest north study area. On first blush, it looks much better, 95% persistence here. However, Sue had 3 solid years of survey work, and I do plan on getting out there next year, but we haven't been able to do follow-ups, and we don't have some of the earlier years of data. So based on my criteria, most sites inherently don't even meet that 3 to 4 years of monitoring, or certainly not 8. So if you take it the next step and think like, okay, so most of these territories have only been looked at for 2 or 3 years. If you look at and say like, of those territories that had no evidence of occupancy for those 2 or 3 years, plus their nests were all dilapidated, or there were no new nests, then we're looking at 67% persistence, which is a bit better, but it still means 33% of our territories up there have also been lost. And then the Northeast, I won't bore you with that, because the take home there is the vast majority of them are occupied, and they do seem to be persistent. So now I'm going to shift gears and look at some other elements of what makes Ferruginous Hawks tick. First, we're looking at breeding success. And so this graph here, we're going to look at 4 different indices, as you see in the legend there to the right. Everything other than the 4th, the young per occupied territory, everything else is based off of the left-hand vertical axis, so your y-axis to the left, and that's 0 to 1. And first, if you look at that blue line and you take it over by year, these last 2 years, so what I had shown you before was up through 2023. We've had some pretty vigorous monitoring in the Northeast in 2024 and 2025. So this includes a broader time frame. But basically, as far as annual territory occupancy, if you include that entire window, we're looking at 91.2% per year. You do see that that blue line moves around a little bit, but largely they're mostly on territory. Breeding rate, which is that's the black diamonds here. That is defined as, of the territories that are occupied, how many of them go on to attempt breeding. And there are a handful that seemingly don't for one reason or another. The vast majority of them is just territory that usually attempt to breed. And then, but how successful are they? So the red line that you see here, again, by year, you see that on average, it's 61.5% breeding success. But you can have huge swings anywhere from 22, or what we've seen so far is 22 to about 91% success. And success is defined as just a minimum of at least one nestling having left the nest on its own power, basically fledged on its own. And then the final bit is this black dash line that you see on the bottom. This is productivity, and the way we define that in raptor biology terms, that's number of young per occupied territory. So that includes those pairs that don't attempt to breed, those pairs that do attempt but fail, and also those that are successful. And at least in Nevada, they have generally 1 to 4 nestlings per year. I've never seen higher than 4, but it's possible. And I know in other areas you sometimes get 5 or even 6. But you see this, the variation. So on average, it's 1.2 young per occupied territory, but that can range anywhere from 0.2 up to 2.3. So it just gives you a kind of an idea how well they're doing reproductively. Another question is, what do they eat? I will say, so like we've mentioned, I've done 22 years of raptor research in Nevada now. These are one of the most frustrating species to deal with as far as determining what they feed on, because they keep the absolute tidiest nest that I've ever seen. So I do a lot of peregrine work, I do a lot of eagle work. You go in there, and how I define diet during the nesting season is you're looking for scraps, you're looking for remains, leftovers. Ferruginous Hawks, since 2017, I've been able to identify a grand total of 30 individuals, which, to put that in perspective, sometimes I go into a peregrine nest and I've got 30 individuals at that moment. So they can be frustrating. Even so, I think I have a general idea of what they're feeding on in this state. The biggest piece of this puzzle, the pie, is mammalian, of which most of those are either cottontail rabbits, black-tailed jackrabbits, a couple, 2 or 3 different species of ground squirrel, and then a couple species of kangaroo rat. That orange piece of the pie are birds. So sorry to say that, but birds eat birds. We all know that. It tends to be horned larks or sage thrashers, what I've seen. And then a very small reptiles. And that's been actually all I've seen is gopher snakes at this point. Breeding phenology. So when do they nest? How does that operate? And there's a nice Dartmoor female and a teeny tiny nest there on the left. But overall breeding season is basically late March through July, and that includes courtship all the way through post-fledgling. And I'll touch on the post-fledgling in a minute. On average, they incubate for about a month, 32 days. And then after they hatch, it's about a month and a half before they fledge and leave the nest on their own. When do they actually lay eggs? So on average, that's April 12th, but there's some variability. So the earliest I've seen is March 25th. That can extend into May. May 10th is the latest I've seen. That has real ramifications though. So especially in a state like Nevada where it's extremely hot, a lot of prey items either estivate and become inactive in the latter half of the summer, or they go underground, they spend a lot of time underground, or they only go nocturnal, of which Ferruginous hawks don't do super well hunting at night. So really, it is highly advantageous to nest earlier than later. In fact, we see much higher failure rates of pairs that nest later in the season. But on average, between the first pair that lays an egg and the last pair that lays an egg in any given year, it's about 25 days. So it's a spread over 3.5 weeks. Average hatching date, as you would guess, mid-May, because they incubate for about a month. Fledging date, this is a little bit different. So early June or June 12th is my overall mean. The reason why that's not a month and a half after hatching is because, again, that's kind of biased or skewed towards the early nesters. Late nesters tend not to be successful, so therefore we don't have a fledging date for them. And then this is all basically obtained based by groundwork on foot, going out with spotting scope and binoculars. The next piece, it needs technology. So you can't follow around fledglings very easily because they are secretive. They don't like people. Usually they get pretty grumpy. So they're either going to try to hide, or they're going to get annoyed, or they're going to fly away. So your presence is going to influence what they're doing. So the only way to get a good solid idea of when they truly depart the natal area or their territory is using telemetry. In this case, I use satellite tags, transmitters. And so on average, after they fledge, it's about a month later they depart, and then they depart big distances. So they go hundreds of miles in most cases. Um, but that can range anywhere from 16 to 43 days. By and large, this is extremely short post-fledging natal dependency period. Most species this size, it'll be 2, 3 months. Eagles sometimes are 4, 5, 6 months. So these guys leave really quick. Most likely that has consequences though. And I will get into that in a second, but basically by leaving early, that means you're no longer under protective care of mom and dad. They're not feeding you, they're not protecting you, things like that. So you're a bit more vulnerable. But most likely that early departure is probably availability. It just is what it is out here. But how do I track them? So I use two different types of transmitters. They're about 26 grams, almost pretty much the size of a tube of chapstick, except rectangular. They're backpack mounted. I fit them to break away. So usually after 3 to 4 years, they'll break away on their own. So that way the bird doesn't have to fly around with it for the rest of his life. On average, I've tracked them, these individuals. So grand total at this point of 34 individuals. I've myself and collaborators. I do want to note the others. We've tracked them for about 235 days. However, the median is much shorter than that. So only 66 days. And that's really driven by very, very high early mortality rates. So the range that goes anywhere from 4 days out of the nest, all the way up to 1,800. And I will note that 1,800, that's a bird that's still flying around, and this was as of April. So we've got well over 2,000, 2,000, well, no, not quite 2,000, but approaching 2,000 days of tracking, at least on one individual. Hatch year mortality. Now, this is kind of the key thing, because overall, I've kind of been painting a pretty good picture for the Northeast. But these are, the vast majority of these birds are birds that I've tagged in the Northeast. I have put transmitters on 2 or 3 from the Northwest. So some of that data is mixed in here, but most of these are from the Northeast, southern areas. Hatch year mortality, basically 77% of them don't live that first year. They don't make it past 365 days out of the nest. 20 out of 26 individuals have died so far from 2018 through the present.
You know how, by any chance?
Predation is a big one. Things like to eat them, and some of the, so yeah, they eat birds, but birds also eat them. So golden eagles and great horned owls are some of their more prevalent predators. They also, because once they leave the nest, they're really, most raptors are very poor flying to begin with in the first week or two. So these guys, especially nesting either on the ground or these tiny little junipers, they're spending nights sometimes on the ground or on little rocky outcrops. So coyotes get them a lot. So it's predation is definitely a big one. Once they disperse out of the natal area, then you start seeing starvation. And I've also had a couple instances where it looks like secondary poisoning from rodenticide. So, but I think honestly, in order of importance, it's most likely from the ones that the work I've been doing is predation, starvation, and then some poisoning. So very high, and Ferruginous hawks overall are known as a species with really high first-year mortality rates, whether you look in Wyoming, Saskatchewan, Washington, but nothing has approached this in all the literature that I've ever seen. You're basically looking between 40 and 60% mortality. We're looking at 77. Now, how many of them even, I probably should have reordered this, but how many of them actually leave the natal area? So again, that's about that first month of life. 20% of them don't even survive that period. Most of that is from predation. So 6 out of 30 individuals didn't ever leave the protective care of their parents. That actually isn't horrible though, when you compare it to other studies. So what you see in most of the other work, and again, there's not a ton of it, but in a half dozen studies that I've seen since the mid 70s, you're looking at mortality rates, or not even getting out of the natal area, of anywhere from 30 to 40%. So, so we have actually a little bit lower mortality prior to departure of natal area than we see the rest of the year. Another question I get all the time is where do they go? Which is, logical and good question. So I haven't, with the transmitter data, I'll show you some data here in a minute. I haven't done formal analysis of these hundreds of thousands or 100,000 data points yet. But so just going to give you kind of preliminary snapshots. overall, 91% of the time, they're gonna move either northeast or eastward. And oftentimes the primary area, or at least, 8 out of those 22 individuals went to the Snake River Plain up in southern Idaho. They do, again, as I'll show you in a minute here, it's not like a north-south migration. It's also not simple like an A and B migration. They tend to do at least 3 locations that they stop, sometimes more. So basically their first point, which I call fall or late summer, fall, others call it summer migration. That first area in Nevada, they're basically heading northeast and eastward. Before we get into some of the larger distance stuff, I just want to show you what they're doing before they leave their natal area. So this is a map of the primary study area in central Nevada. These gold stars, it's a grand total of 8 different territories. Those are the nests that I've banded nestlings in and then put on transmitters. And so kind of these funny gray amorphous looking polygons and dots, those are movements from the transmitter data, which they're taking hourly fixes. And so gives you an idea. The shades of green, dark green, all the way through kind of a dark orange, that is modeled canopy cover of pinyon juniper woodlands. So it does show you the actually do nest on the interface between sagebrush and PJ. They're not using the woodlands very much at all, though. It's mostly kind of out in the flats, and this is what you see the parents do as well. Most of their foraging is out in the open valleys and open flats. And then just to kind of hone in on one of those territories, this is one bird, its month prior to departure. And this one did actually leave almost to a dot, I believe, a month after fledging. The gray dots there, those are the actual movements or locations, the fixes. We buffered those points by 100 meters or no, 150 meters, just to kind of account for movements between hours, and also the fact that we know we have some limited precision in some instances with our GPS accuracy. So the nest for this particular territory is in that gold dot in the center of the screen. And again, it do sometimes spend some time in juniper, but even that, those colors, I of course lost the legend here, but I mean, we're talking 10-15% canopy cover, so they're not in dense PJ at all. Okay, so now where do they go after they leave Nevada, or what do they do throughout the year? Breaking down, this is fairly standard for Ferruginous hawks. Breeding season is defined as March through August. It's a little bit later than I would focus on based on when our birds leave, but I kind of am sticking standard with what's been done elsewhere. Fall would be September and October. Winter in blue here is November through February. Those numbers that you see, that's the number of accurate GPS points, and I've scrubbed out all of the inaccurate points. So I think it's somewhere around 100,000 of the highly precise data points. This image on the upper right, this is a different study. It's Jim Watson and colleagues in 2018, and they were looking at Ferruginous hawks in the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington. So for theirs, their color scheme is all different than mine. Of course, I should have probably stayed standard there. But their breeding range is in red there. The yellow lines are the tracks they take on their, they call it summer migration. I would call it fall. And then the yellow dots, that's where they spend that kind of the fall period. And for their winter migration, those are the blue tracks, and then with the blue dots. So primarily wintering in California, Arizona, and then a couple in Colorado and even Oklahoma before heading back to Washington. So now for our data, I just wanted to kind of paint that picture. There's not a lot of this type of data for this species. So I didn't have a whole lot to compare to, but in my data, I apologize, it's all raw. I haven't really broken this down yet by individual. These the green dots, these are simply all of the accumulated data points during that breeding season. There are tracked individuals, of which there's 34 of them from 15 different territories of the high quality GPS locations, about 100,000 GPS points. So you do see them, they start moving, you see them starting to trend, mostly northeast. I will say what you see in California, that's almost kind of seems like they're spending the fall in California. That's kind of an artifact of late winter coming into breeding season. So try to ignore that for a second. The red color, this is their fall, again, September and October. So you see they've mostly moved out of the state. really focusing in southern Idaho, but also bouncing around. Once after they hit Idaho, what you actually do see is a lot of those birds then either go further east or southeast. So down into Utah, into Arizona, New Mexico, places like that. Some getting over into California. And by winter, most of them are wintering in California. We do have wintering birds here, our own birds in Nevada. Most of the wintering Ferruginous hawks that you see here, though, are most likely from other states, from what I can tell. But we have some of ours that stay local. And then certainly Arizona, New Mexico, northern Texas, places like that, Utah to some extent. This is our champion. Now it's an adult male. I banded him in 2020. And this guy has failed me. He's never once settled down on a territory, so he's wandered his 5 years of life. Where his natal nest was that red star. So he actually comes back to the area pretty much every year, thinking, why don't you settle in? So I don't, yeah, based on what's going on in the Northwest, I don't really want him to go there, but still, I'd like him to go somewhere. But yeah, so the green, these are breeding movements and breeding locations. I screwed up the color scheme here, so now fall is orange instead of red. But again, he's basically every year he's going up to Idaho, dropping back down to California in the winter. Although these last 2 winters, he spent time mostly in the Lovelock and Carson Sink area in Nevada. So he's trending more Nevada, and maybe he'll breed next year. So cross my fingers.
Have you ever caught him a second time, or is just that the only time you?
That's it, yeah. And these transmitters are rated to at least 3 years. So I'm just also crossing, and I do breakaway stitching, so they're kind of designed to fall away. So I'm like, I hope you stay on long enough to actually. And then at least I'd have a fighting chance to recapture him. But unless I know where he's breeding, that's right. He's got to find his lady. So anyways, I'm probably running way long here. Sorry about that. I feel a little scattered, so apologies. But kind of painted a couple different pictures, at least when you think about like Northwest versus Northeastern. And then even in the Northeast, it seems like it's great static population, everything's good until you look at the transmitter data and you realize it's not so good. We have extremely high mortality rates. So basically this species, they're still facing some hurdles. What I want to leave you with is kind of just thinking about some of the threats that they face, conservation threats. I touched on those in the beginning of the talk, and I just kind of want to bring it full circle. So we know beyond the shadow that we have increased frequency of wildfires, both intensity and frequency across the landscape. That can cause direct mortality when it burns up nesting areas, but it can also create vast areas of habitat loss, converting sagebrush and shrublands to exotic grasses. So that's definitely an impact. Climate change, which is really difficult, if not impossible, to unwind that from climate change, but we certainly have impacts from climate change. We've got increasing temperatures, increasing and unpredictable storm events, which have definitely take a toll. So when you get some late season, even cold snaps in May, will wipe out almost entire nesting areas, and it'll kill nestlings because they absorb the water and basically chill. So extreme hot and then also cold wet. Those are the two biggest killers of Ferruginous hawks. Landscape scale, we definitely have, we're fortunate to live in Nevada. It's an amazing state. We have wide open landscapes, but we also have very, very large landscape development, efforts. So it's a balance. I'll accept that. It's something we've got to just keep in mind. But large scale mining as well as solar projects, they all encourage on Ferruginous hawk habitat. Wind power, we don't have much of that in Nevada. We do have plenty of wind power facilities. We've only got one on public land, and that's out there by Great Basin National Park. But that also happens to be right next to a handful of Ferruginous hawk territories. So, and if you look really, really close, you'll see there's a nestling that I went on the band right here in that tree. So, yeah, we've got to worry about there. And finally, I'm wrapping up. You don't pull this off without, collaborators, but also tons of folks just that I haven't named as actual specific collaborators, but have done awesome work administratively, helping getting me funds, but also field work of going out there and monitoring, helping me with banding, transmitter deployment, all that kind of stuff. So I guarantee I've missed folks here. I apologize for that. but also agency support, with US Fish and Wildlife Service, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and Bureau of Land Management have all been really, really helpful. And finally, my family, wife and kids, they don't get a say in it. They always get to get dragged out in the field. So every year they get to go help with Ferruginous Hawks and others. So